"Be my fake wife," he said, not asking, barely even whispering. His jaw set and his eyes fixed on Victor Hale 20 feet away. "Right now. Say yes right now or everything I have is gone by morning." Eliza Hart looked at this man she had known for exactly 4 days. She looked at his hand, steady open, waiting. She looked at the ring he was holding, plain silver, clearly his dead wife's. Her heart was doing something she didn't have a name for. She had 37 cents, a torn sleeve, and a warrant with her name on it waiting in Denver. She took the ring. "Yes," she said. "God help us both." If this story already has its hooks in you, welcome. Subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next on this street is just the beginning. The whole town heard it. Every man leaning against a post, every woman pausing in a shop doorway, every child sitting on a wagon bed. They all heard Eliza Hart say those 6 words to Victor Hale, and not one of them breathed for a solid 3 seconds afterward. Victor Hale was not a man people spoke to that way. He owned the largest parcel of land in Granger County, held notes on half the businesses on this street, and had put more than one family out on the road in the dead of winter without losing a single night's sleep over it. He was 53 years old, thick through the chest, and had learned early in life that other people's fear was the most reliable currency there was. He blinked at her. Just once. Then the smile came back, different now, harder at the edges, the kind that meant she'd just made a decision she didn't fully understand yet. "Say that again," he said quietly. Eliza didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. She reached down, picked up her carpet bag, and slung it over her shoulder. "I didn't come to Caldwell looking for trouble," she said. "I came looking for work. If you have a problem with women looking for honest employment in this town, that's your problem, Mr. Hale, not mine." One of the men flanking Victor, a wide-shouldered ranch hand named Cord, who had the look of someone who'd been paid specifically to stand close to powerful people, took one step forward. Eliza turned her eyes to him. "Don't," she said. Cord stopped. Not because he was afraid of her, he wasn't. Not yet, but because something in the flatness of her voice made him hesitate, and hesitation in moments like this was enough. Victor tilted his head. "You came in on the morning stage. Nobody in this town knows you. You've got no job, no kin here, and from the look of that bag, you've got about as much money as my boot heel. And you're standing in the middle of my street telling me what's your problem and what's mine." "It's everyone's street," Eliza said. A man near the hardware store made a sound, not quite a laugh, just a short exhale of disbelief. Victor heard it. His jaw tightened. "You worked for Richard Vance in Denver," he said, and the way he said it, careful, deliberate, told her immediately that it wasn't a question. He already knew. He'd already decided. He'd been deciding since before she stepped off that stage. "That name means something to you." Her chest went cold, but her face didn't move. "I worked for a lot of people," she said. "Denver's a big city." "Richard says you stole from him." The street went quieter than it had any right to be for a Wednesday morning. "Richard says a lot of things," Eliza replied. Her voice was steady. Every nerve in her body was screaming, but her voice was steady, and she held on to that the way a drowning person holds onto a piece of driftwood. Victor clasped his hands behind his back. "He also says you're the kind of woman who makes trouble wherever she goes, and I'm the kind of man who doesn't allow trouble in his town." He paused. "So here's what's going to happen. My man Cord is going to carry that bag back to the stage depot, and you're going to get on the next coach out, whichever direction it's going. And if I don't, then I have you held on suspicion of theft until I can wire Denver for a marshal." Eliza knew what that meant. She knew exactly what a warrant from Richard Vance's connections in Denver looked like, and she knew it would hold up long enough to destroy her again, even if it never made it to a courthouse. She'd watched it happen before. She'd been the one it happened to. She looked at the faces watching her from the boardwalks. None of them were going to help her. She could see that clearly. These were people who knew which side of Victor Hale's good opinion they needed to stay on. She didn't blame them. She understood survival better than most. But she was so tired of surviving on other people's terms. "You have no legal authority to detain me," she said. "You're not a marshal. You're not a judge. You're a man with land and money who's gotten used to those two things being the same as law." She took one step toward him. "They're not." Victor's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not yet. Something more calculating than anger. "Cord," he said. Cord reached for her arm, and Eliza swung her carpet bag. It caught him squarely across the ear. The bag was heavy-packed solid with everything she owned in the world, which wasn't much, but included a cast-iron hairbrush and a full change of clothes, and Cord stumbled sideways with a grunt of genuine surprise. The street erupted, not violently, not into chaos, but into the kind of electric, disbelieving noise that a crowd makes when something happens that no one thought was actually possible. Victor's second man lunged forward and Eliza dropped the bag and put herself sideways the way her father had taught her when she was 9 years old, and the world had already shown her it wasn't going to be gentle. The man's grip caught her sleeve, not her arm, and she pulled hard and fast and felt the fabric tear. "That's enough." The voice came from across the street, not loud, not sharp, but carrying the kind of quiet authority that cut through crowd noise the way a cold wind cuts through wool. Not asking, not warning, just stating a fact about what was going to happen next. Everyone turned. The man standing at the edge of the boardwalk was lean somewhere north of 35, with the weathered look of someone who spent more time outside than in. He wore a work coat and plain boots, and nothing about him announced wealth or position. But he stood like a man who owned the ground under his feet, which it would turn out he did. "Victor," the man said. Victor Hale's expression went through several changes in quick succession. "Cole. This woman causing you a problem. This woman," Victor said, biting the words off, "is a thief and a troublemaker, and I was in the process of removing her from town. Didn't look like removal from where I was standing." The man, Cole, let his gaze move briefly to Cord, who was still pressing a hand against the side of his head. Then back to Victor. "Looked more like assault. She struck my man, after your man put his hands on her." Cole stepped down off the boardwalk and into the street. He didn't move fast. He didn't posture. He just walked over, calm and even, and stopped a few feet from Eliza. "You all right?" he asked her directly. She looked at him. She didn't know this man. She had no reason to trust him. And she'd learned in the past 3 years that men who stepped in to help women on public streets usually wanted something for it. "I'm fine," she said carefully. "You got somewhere to be in this town?" "I was looking for work." He nodded once like that answered something, and then he turned back to Victor. "She's with me," he said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. Heavier, loaded. Victor stared at him. "She's a stranger off the stage, Daniel. You don't know anything about her." "I know she didn't start this," Daniel Cole said. "And I know you're standing in the middle of Main Street with 2 men trying to strong-arm a woman with a carpet bag." He paused. "That look like law to you, Victor? Because it doesn't look like law to me." Victor's jaw moved. He was calculating Eliza could see it happening the way his eyes went slightly distant, the way his breathing changed. He was deciding what this cost him here now in front of witnesses. He wasn't done. She could see that too. But he was smart enough to choose his ground. "You're making a mistake, Cole," he said finally. "Probably," Daniel agreed. "Wouldn't be the first time." He reached down, picked up Eliza's carpet bag without asking, and looked at her with an expression that was not warm exactly, but was also not unkind. "I've got a ranch 3 miles outside of town," he said quietly, just for her. "I need a cook. The work's hard, the pay's fair, and Victor Hale's authority ends at my property line. That a situation you can live with." Eliza looked at him. She looked at Victor, who had gone very still in the way that predators go still before they move. She looked at the faces still watching from the boardwalks. She had 37 cents. She had a torn sleeve. She had Richard Vance's name following her across every county line between here and Denver. "Yes," she said. Daniel Cole nodded. He handed her the bag. And they walked away from Victor Hale together side by side, not hurrying while the whole town of Caldwell watched and said nothing. The ride out to the ranch was quiet for a long time. Daniel drove. Eliza sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the town fall away behind them, and she was very aware that she had just gotten into a vehicle with a stranger, based on approximately 4 minutes of observation, and the fact that he'd picked up her bag without being asked. "You don't have to tell me anything," Daniel said without looking at her. She glanced at him. "About Denver," he clarified. "About Vance. Not my business, unless you make it my business." "You know Richard Vance?" "I know of him. Same way I know of a lot of men whose reach extends further than their names should travel." He kept his eyes on the road. "Victor's been trying to acquire land in this county for 2 years. He's connected to people in Denver in the land office in a few places he'd prefer I didn't know about. I've been watching him careful." "So offering me a job," Eliza said slowly, "was that about me or about Victor?" He thought about that for a moment. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than answering too fast. "Honest answer," he said. "Preferably both." He glanced at her then, just briefly. "You needed a way out of that street that didn't end with you in Victor's custody. That part was about you. The part where having you on my property complicates his ability to harass me further. That part's about me." He looked back at the road. "I figure you deserve to know what you're stepping into." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "Most people would have just made it sound like charity," she said. "I don't much like charity," he said. "Neither direction." She turned that over in her mind. "I didn't steal from Richard Vance," she said. "Didn't figure you did." "He fired me because I wouldn't—" She stopped, steadied herself. He had a particular idea about what women in his employment owed him beyond their wages. I disagreed with that idea fairly loudly. 2 days later, 3 people he paid claimed I'd taken money from his household accounts. Daniel didn't say anything. "The amount they claimed was exactly what I was owed in back wages," she added, which I thought was a particularly ugly kind of irony. "Did you have anyone to speak for you?" "I had my own word, which, as you might imagine, didn't go very far against a man with Richard Vance's name and Richard Vance's lawyers." She looked out at the flat, dry land rolling past. "I left Denver before they could formalize the warrant, which means it's sitting somewhere waiting, which means Victor Hale has something to hold over me as long as I'm in his county." "And now you're on my property," Daniel said. "And now I'm on your property." Another silence, different from the first one. "I meant what I said about the pay being fair," he said, "and about your history being your own business. But I need to know one thing." "What?" "Are you going to stay? Because I can't use someone who disappears the moment Victor turns up the pressure, and he will turn up the pressure. That's his nature." Eliza looked at the road ahead. She thought about Denver. She thought about the 3 towns between Denver and here where she'd stopped for a week, each worked quietly, kept her head down, and moved on again when she felt the walls starting to close. She thought about how exhausted that was, how the running itself had started to feel like a kind of defeat she'd never planned for. "I'll stay as long as the job is what you say it is," she said. "Fair enough," Daniel said. They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was for the first time in longer than she could remember not uncomfortable. Dead. The ranch was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected something as composed and deliberate as the man who owned it maybe. What she found instead was a working property in the plain and functional way that meant someone cared about what it produced rather than how it appeared. The barn needed paint on 2 sides. The fence posts on the north side of the yard were uneven. The kitchen, when she walked in for the first time, was clean, but starkly organized, the kind of clean that meant a man who cooked purely for fuel rather than any pleasure in it. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around. Previous cook, she asked. Left 6 weeks ago. Married a farmer 2 counties over. Before her, a pause. My wife. Eliza turned. He was standing just behind her, and his expression had gone somewhere she recognized. Not grief, not quite, but the place just past grief where a person learns to speak around the absence like it's a stone in the road they've memorized the location of. I'm sorry, she said. 3 years ago, he said the way people say things they've said many times before and learned to say without flinching. Fever. Went fast. He moved past her into the kitchen. Supplies are in the pantry. I generally eat at 6. The hands eat at the same time. There are 4 of them, and none of them are difficult. Any questions about the stove, the oldest hand, Pete knows it better than I do. Mr. Cole, he turned. Thank you, she said, for what you did on that street. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Don't thank me yet, he said. Victor's not done. Whatever that looked like out there today, that was him choosing the timing, not backing down. You understand the difference? She did. She understood it better than she wanted to. Yes, she said. He nodded once and left her in the kitchen, and she stood there alone in the quiet of the ranch house and took her first real breath since stepping off the stage that morning. It felt fragile, like breathing through thin ice. But it was something. She lasted 2 days before Victor Hale made his next move. She'd known it was coming. Daniel had warned her, and she'd cataloged the warning and stored it carefully alongside everything else she was cataloging about this place. The rhythm of the ranch, the 4 hands whose names were Pete Cal, a young man called Bo, and a quiet older man named Asa, who spoke rarely and watched everything. She'd learned the stove, learned the pantry, learned what time each man woke and what they expected at breakfast, and how to make coffee strong enough to satisfy Pete, who had opinions about coffee that bordered on the spiritual. She was in the middle of making bread when Pete came in the back door with an expression that meant something had happened that he'd been asked to tell her about and didn't relish the job. Riders on the road, he said. 2 of them, asking around the property line about who's living here. Eliza kept kneading. Hale's men. Cord's one of them. Other one I don't know. Did Mr. Cole see them? He's out riding the east fence. Bo went to get him. She thought for a moment. Then she folded the dough, covered it, and wiped her hands. Where are they now? Sitting at the road line. Haven't crossed. Yet. That yet was doing a lot of work. She walked to the front of the house and looked out through the window. 2 riders exactly where Pete said. Cord was easy to recognize. She'd know that particular bulk anywhere. The other was younger, sharper-featured, holding himself very still in the saddle in the way of someone who'd been told to observe rather than act. They were counting windows. They were noting exits. They were doing, she realized with a cold, clear certainty, exactly what a man like Victor Hale did. Before he took a next step, he sent people to measure the ground. She heard horses coming fast from the east. Daniel came around the side of the house at a controlled canter and pulled up sharp when he saw the 2 men at the road. He sat for a moment without moving. Then he rode slowly toward them, and she watched from the window as he stopped 10 feet away and spoke. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see Cord's posture shift, could see the younger rider look down and then away. A minute later, both riders turned and left. Daniel came back to the house. What did you say to them? She asked when he came through the front door. He hung his coat. Told them this was private property and uninvited guests don't do well here. That's all? He looked at her. Cord asked if the new woman at the ranch was the same woman from the stage. She waited. I told him she was my wife, Daniel said. The kitchen went very quiet. Eliza stared at him. You told him... I know what I said. Mr. Cole, that's a lie, he said flatly. Yes, I know it's a lie. He moved past her to the table and sat down, which was the first time she'd seen him sit anywhere that wasn't a saddle or a wagon bench. He looked tired, not physically, something deeper than physical. Victor's next move is legal. I've been watching him long enough to know his sequence. He sends men to count what I have. Then he files a complaint, usually something about land use or water rights, something that requires a formal response. Then he introduces complications. One of those complications for a single man on a ranch is that a woman living in his house without formal status can be painted as anything he wants to paint her as. Eliza was very still. "But a wife," she said slowly. "A wife is legally protected. Her presence is explained. Her status isn't subject to Victor's creative interpretation." He met her eyes. "It's not a permanent solution, but it buys time. Time to find a real solution. And if someone checks, the circuit judge comes through in 8 weeks. In 8 weeks, a great many things can change." He paused. "I'm not asking you to lie for me. I'm telling you what I said, and I'm telling you why, and I'm telling you that you have every right to walk back out that door if it's not something you can agree to." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about what 8 weeks of security felt like. Not running, not watching the road, not sleeping with one ear open. She thought about what Victor Hale's warrant would mean if she was standing on this ranch without Daniel Cole's name around her like a fence. "If I'm your wife," she said carefully, "there are things that will need to be consistent. Names, dates, a story that holds up when people ask questions, and people will ask questions." "I know. I'll need to know enough about you to answer them." He nodded. "I'll tell you what you need to know." "And the hands. Pete already figured it out," he said with something that might almost have been amusement. "The other 3 will follow his lead." She exhaled, slowly. "Eliza Cole," she said, testing the shape of it. He said nothing, but something moved through his expression briefly quickly, and then it was gone. "It's a temporary arrangement," he said. "Of course." She agreed. Neither of them were entirely sure they believed that, and outside on the road back to Caldwell, Cord was already riding hard, already composing in his head what he was going to tell Victor Hale about the woman at the Cole Ranch, about her straight spine and her steady eyes, and the way the rancher had called her his wife without a single second of hesitation. Victor was going to want to hear every word of it, and what he was going to do with those words was something Eliza didn't know yet. But she could feel it gathering the way you feel a storm before the sky changes, something large and cold and entirely aimed at her rolling in from the west. The bread was still rising in the kitchen. She went back to it. Because the hands needed to eat at 6, and she had agreed to stay, and whatever was coming, she had decided she was done running toward the next town with her sleeve torn and her pockets empty. Whatever Victor Hale sent next, she would be here for it. The first week passed. The way first weeks do, when 2 people are learning to share space without knowing how much of themselves to offer carefully by degrees, with a lot of unspoken negotiation happening in the silences between sentences. Eliza learned Daniel Cole's routines, the way she learned everything, by watching, by measuring, by filing away details until a full picture assembled itself. He was up before light every morning without exception. He took his coffee black and didn't talk during it, not rudely, just with the settled quiet of a man who needed those first minutes to himself before the day claimed him. He ate whatever she put in front of him, without complaint, which was either good manners or indifference, and she hadn't decided which yet. He came in for supper at 6 on the dot, and if something kept him past 6:15, he sent word with one of the hands. She was beginning to understand a man who kept his word in the small things as automatically as breathing. Because he'd decided long ago that small promises were what large ones were built on. She found that out on the 3rd day, when she overheard him tell Beau, who had made some casual promise to fix the north fence before Sunday, and then quietly not done it. "If you said you'd do it, then you do it. That's the whole of it." Beau fixed the fence that evening working by lantern light. Eliza had stood in the kitchen and thought, this is a man who has decided very deliberately what kind of person he is going to be. She didn't know yet what it had cost him to make that decision. She was starting to want to know. 10. On Thursday of the first week, a woman named Clara Hutchins rode out from town with a pie. Eliza heard the horse and dried her hands and came to the front door. And Clara Hutchins, 40 sharp-eyed, with the kind of careful cheerfulness that meant she was here to gather information rather than deliver pastry. Took one long look at Eliza and said, "You must be the new Mrs. Cole." "I must be," Eliza agreed pleasantly. Clara held out the pie. Apple from the smell of it. "I'm Clara Hutchins. My husband runs the general store. We've been neighbors with Daniel for going on 7 years now." She paused, waiting to see how Eliza would respond to that, to the implication of long history of prior claim to knowledge about this man and this property. Eliza smiled and stepped back from the door. "Come in. I just put coffee on." That was the right move. Clara came in. She sat at the kitchen table, accepted coffee, and asked in the bright casual way of someone who had thought carefully about how to ask, "Where did you and Daniel meet?" He never mentioned a courtship. "Daniel's not much of a mentioner," Eliza said. Clara laughed, genuine surprised. "No, he certainly is not." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "He's a good man. Quiet but good. After Margaret passed, we all worried about him. 3 years alone on this ranch with nothing but the work." She looked at Eliza steadily. "He deserves someone who's going to stay." There it was. Not a threat. Not an accusation. Something more complicated than both the concern of a woman who genuinely cared about a man she'd watched grieve and who was now sitting across from a stranger in that man's kitchen and trying to decide whether the stranger was worthy of him. Eliza met her eyes. "Mrs. Hutchins," she said quietly, "I'm not here to hurt him." Clara held her gaze for a long moment. Then something in her shoulders relaxed. "Clara," she said, "and I believe you." She stayed for an hour. By the time she left, she'd told Eliza which merchant in town sold the best flour, which one cheated on weights, and that Victor Hale had been asking questions around town about the new woman at the Cole Ranch, her history, her connections, whether anyone knew her family. "He's been poking at it since Tuesday," Clara said at the door, her voice dropping just slightly. "I thought you should know. I don't care for Victor Hale and I never have." Eliza held the pie and watched Clara right away, and then stood very still for a moment, running the numbers. Victor had started asking questions Tuesday, the same day Cord rode out, and Daniel told him about a wife, which meant Victor didn't believe it, which meant the questions were going to get sharper. She put the pie on the counter and went to find Daniel. He was in the barn working on a harness that had needed attention for several days. "Victor's been asking about me in town since Tuesday," she said. "Not generally, specifically. He's looking for the edge of the story." Daniel kept working. "I figured he would. He's going to find something. I had employers between Denver and here, 3 towns. The stories are consistent, but they're thin. A woman on her own moving through territory doesn't attract a lot of documentation, and that cuts both ways. What do you need?" She looked at him. He'd asked it the same way someone asks what tool to hand over practical, direct, no performance of generosity. "I need the marriage to have a history," she said. "Something that answers the question before Victor gets to ask it properly. Where we met, when, why we married quickly. Something specific enough to hold up." Daniel set down the harness. He turned to face her fully, and she had the odd sensation of being actually looked at, not assessed, not measured, just seen. "We met in Abilene," he said. 2 years ago. I was there for the spring cattle sale. You were working in a boarding house there. We wrote letters for a year. When I felt ready to think about the future again, I wrote and asked if you'd come." She studied him. "That's very specific. It's also true mostly. I was in Abilene 2 years ago. I did stay at a boarding house, and a woman did work there, who I had one conversation with over supper." He picked up the harness again. "Her name was Ellen, not Eliza. But names are easy. You thought about this already." "I thought about it the moment I said the word wife to Cord." He glanced at her. "I don't do things without thinking them through." She was quiet for a moment. "Abilene. A year of letters. Married last month quietly, just family, except neither of us has family close, which is why no one attended." "That works. And if Victor finds Ellen in Abilene..." Ellen married a livestock buyer from Kansas in October and moved away. I know because Pete's cousin was at the wedding. Eliza stared at him. A very slow smile moved across her face before she could stop it. You are more complicated than you look, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Brief, unguarded, the first entirely unguarded thing she'd seen from him. Then it was gone. Everybody is, he said, and went back to the harness. Saturday brought trouble in a different shape. Eliza was at the well when she heard it raised voices from the direction of the east fence, and then a sound she knew from Denver, the specific crack of wood under deliberate force. Not wind damage, not accident. She dropped the bucket and ran. By the time she reached the east field, Cal was already there, and the fence that Daniel had spent 3 days repairing after the spring damage was down, not just down, but pulled down posts, yanked from the earth, with the kind of force that required either many men or very deliberate machinery. Fresh wheel tracks in the dirt ran parallel to the fence line and disappeared north. Cal was shaking. Not from fear, from fury. This was done last night, he said. Had to be. I came out at sunup and didn't see it, which means it was dark, which means they knew exactly where to come and didn't need light to find it. Which meant someone had been watching the ranch from close in for at least a day. Eliza looked at the wheel tracks. Then she looked at the tree line north of the fence. Then she looked at Cal. Where's Mr. Cole? Rode out to the creek to check the water level. Bo went to get him. Go get Pete, she said. Tell him I need him to walk the entire south fence line and check for similar damage. Don't fix anything yet. I want Daniel to see it first. Cal looked at her with an expression that was just slightly surprised, not because the instructions were wrong, but because they'd come from her with that particular kind of decisiveness. He went. Eliza stood alone at the broken fence and looked at the wheel tracks and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but the cold, functional clarity that arrives when a person who has spent years watching things get taken from them finally decides they are going to fight instead of flee. Victor wasn't going to just make things uncomfortable. He was going to try to break this ranch. Which meant she needed Daniel to understand that she was not an additional vulnerability he'd taken on. She was going to be an asset, whatever that required. So, Daniel came back hard and fast. He looked at the fence, he looked at the tracks. He crouched down and studied the post holes the way the wood had splintered, and he was quiet for a very long time. South fence is fine, Pete reported coming up behind them. But there's something else. Water channel on the east side of the lower field. Someone's been at the banks. Not major, not yet, but it's been disturbed in a way that's not natural. Daniel stood up slowly. He's testing, Daniel said, seeing how I respond, whether I file a complaint or absorb it or run to the land office. And what do? Eliza asked. I fix the fence, he said, and I note every piece of damage, every date, every detail. And I keep quiet about it publicly until I have enough documentation to bury him with. That takes time. It does. What happens to the ranch while you're taking time? He looked at her. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything yet, she said. I'm asking whether you have anyone in the county who can verify the water rights documentation. Because if Victor's plan is to challenge those rights legally, and it sounds like it is, then you need someone who was there when they were filed, who can speak to their validity. Daniel was very still. How do you know that's the play? Because it's what Richard Vance did to the man who owned the boarding house where I worked in Cottonwood. He found a flaw in the property deed, a small one barely significant, and he used it as a lever to get the owner into a legal proceeding that cost more to fight than to settle. She met his eyes. Victor has the same kind of mind. He doesn't break things directly. He finds the structural weakness, and he applies pressure there until the whole thing shifts. Something moved across Daniel's face. Respect, she thought, reluctant and real. The original surveyor was a man named Aldous Webb, he said slowly. He filed the water rights with the county in 1871. Last I heard, he was in Meridian working for the railroad. Can you reach him? By telegraph. Possibly. Then you should do that. she said, "before Victor does." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was flat, and the wind had come up, and she could feel the weight of what they were both standing in. Not just the problem, but the fact of standing in it together, and the strange, complicated thing that was beginning to form between them, that neither of them had a clean word for yet. "You've done this before," he said. "Thought through a problem like this." "I've had a lot of problems," she said. "That's not what I mean." She knew what he meant. "My father was a lawyer," she said, "before the war. He taught me that most fights aren't won or lost in the moment of confrontation. They're won or lost in the preparation before it." She paused. "I used to think that was a cold way to look at things. I've since reconsidered." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll send the telegraph tonight." They walked back to the ranch house together, and she was very aware of how they moved side by side, matching pace without the careful distance of the first few days. And she thought something has shifted. She wasn't sure yet whether that was good or dangerous. In her experience, it was usually both. 3 days later, Victor Hale came to the ranch himself. He didn't send men this time. He came alone, which was either confidence or calculation, or both. And he rode up to the front of the house in the early afternoon, when he would have known, because he'd been having the ranch watch, that Daniel was likely to be inside. Eliza was the one who came to the door. She'd seen him coming from the window, and she'd made a decision before he reached the porch. And the decision was this: she was not going to give him a single inch of ground. "Mr. Hale," she said, pleasant as spring water. Victor looked at her with an expression that was working very hard at being neutral. "Mrs. Cole, my husband isn't available at the moment," she said, which was not entirely true. Daniel was in the next room, and she'd made a slight gesture with her hand as she passed the doorway that she hoped he understood to mean stay where you are and listen. "I came to pay a neighborly call," Victor said, "and to offer my personal apology for the misunderstanding in town last week." Eliza smiled. "What misunderstanding?" The smile on his face tightened by the smallest degree. "My man Cord may have been overzealous in his approach." "Cord put his hands on me," she said still pleasantly. "I wouldn't call that overzealous. I'd call it assault. But I'm willing to let it rest, given that no lasting harm was done." She tilted her head. "To either of us." Victor's eyes moved past her into the house. "Is Daniel?" "As I said, he's occupied." She didn't move from the doorway. "Was there something specific you needed, or was this purely social?" He looked at her directly, then really looked at her, the way he'd been calculating around for the last week, trying to find the angle, and she held his gaze without difficulty, because she had spent 3 years looking at men who were trying to find angles, and she had gotten very good at giving them nothing to find. "You're not from here," he said. "No." Daniel married very suddenly, very quietly. "We're private people," she said. "Some folks are." "Where did you two meet?" "Abilene," she said. 2 years ago. He was there for the spring cattle sale. I was working at a boarding house on Elm Street." She said it exactly the way a person says something true, without emphasis, without the slight rush of someone reciting a prepared story. "We wrote letters for about a year. Then he asked if I'd like to come to Caldwell." She let a small, genuine-looking smile appear. "I said yes." Victor stared at her. She could see him testing it, running it through what he already knew, checking it against whatever his men had dug up about her, looking for the thread that didn't match. And she knew with a cold certainty that he was going to keep pulling until he found something. The question was whether she could hold this long enough. "It's been a difficult winter for Daniel's operation," Victor said pleasantly. "I've noticed some fence trouble on the east side." "These things happen," she said. "Certainly do." He touched the brim of his hat. "Well, I won't keep you. Please give my regards to your husband." "Of course." He turned and rode away, and Eliza stood in the doorway and watched him go and did not move until he was entirely out of sight. Daniel came to stand beside her. "He knows," she said quietly. He suspects, Daniel said. That's not the same thing, Aim. It will be. She turned. Daniel was closer than usual, she registered, because they'd both moved toward the doorway as Victor left, and neither had stepped back. She could see the particular tightness around his jaw that she was beginning to understand meant he was working through something he wasn't ready to say yet. He'll go to Denver, she said. If he hasn't already. He'll try to get Richard's warrant made formal and bring it here with a marshal. How long does that take? A month, maybe less. Depends on who he knows and how much he's willing to pay. She paused. Daniel, if that warrant arrives here, the story doesn't matter. A marshal won't care that I'm Eliza Cole of the Cole Ranch. He'll care about Eliza Hart, formerly of Denver, and what Richard Vance says she did. Daniel looked at her. Really looked at her the same way she'd felt in the barn, that specific quality of attention that was neither assessment nor performance, just actual human noticing. Then we need to move faster than he does, Daniel said. On what? On finding something that makes Richard Vance's word worth nothing. He held her gaze. You said he was connected to Victor. How connected? She thought about that. About the things she'd heard in Richard's household, the names mentioned over supper, the documents she'd seen moved between offices, the conversations she'd been assumed too unimportant to remember. More than either of them would want known, she said slowly. Tell me. So she did. She stood in the doorway of Daniel Cole's house, her house in the story they'd built together for however long that story held, and she told him things she hadn't told anyone because she'd been too afraid the information would be used against her rather than for her. She told him about the land filings she'd seen on Richard's desk, about the name Hale appearing in correspondence she wasn't supposed to have read, about a meeting she'd overheard through a poorly insulated wall between Richard Vance and a man whose voice she'd recognized but whose face she never saw, discussing something called the Caldwell Water Corridor. When she finished, Daniel was very quiet. The Caldwell Water Corridor, he said. That's my East Creek line. That's what feeds half this county through the dry season. I know, she said. And if Vance and Victor have been coordinating since before you left Denver, then this was never just about me, she said. I was in the wrong place. I saw the wrong things. And when I made Richard angry by refusing him, he had a reason to get rid of me that went beyond wounded pride. She steadied herself. I've been running from a conspiracy I was never the target of. I was just the witness they needed to discredit. The silence between them had a different weight now, something heavier and something strangely more solid. You're not a liability, Daniel said. You're evidence. Or I'm the woman they need to destroy before the evidence can speak. He looked at her, and she looked back, and the evening light was coming in low and flat through the front windows, and she thought, this is the moment. This is where it shifts again. Because they were not two people in a practical arrangement anymore. They were two people with a common enemy and a shared knowledge that changed everything about what they were doing here and what it meant. We have to get to Aldous Webb, he said. Before Victor does, she agreed. I'll send Cal to Meridian tomorrow. In person, no telegraph. Victor's got friends at the station. She nodded. Outside, the evening was settling into the particular quiet of a ranch at the end of the day, and somewhere past the north fence line, she knew Victor Hale was sitting in whatever passed for his study and thinking about her. Thinking about the thread he hadn't been able to find yet. Deciding which direction to pull next. She had bought them a few days, maybe a week. It wasn't much. But she had learned in the last 3 years of her life that a person who knows how to use a week can do remarkable things with it. She stepped back from the doorway and went to finish supper. And Daniel stood in the hall for a moment longer, watching the empty road, carrying something in his expression that had not been there a week ago. A heaviness that was not quite worry and not quite hope, but something that lived uncomfortably between them. He didn't name it, but it was there. And outside night was coming in fast from the west, bringing with it the cold smell of weather, and somewhere in the dark, the sound of the creek running along the east line of the property. The creek that ran through everything that connected to everything that two powerful men had decided was worth ruining her life to control. She was not going to let them. Not this time. Not on this ground. Cal left for Meridian before sunup without fanfare, taking the south road that bent away from town and avoided the Hale property entirely. Daniel had given him the name, a description of Aldous Webb, and enough money for a week's travel. Eliza had given him 3 sentences to memorize and repeat exactly as spoken who she was, what she'd seen in Richard Vance's study, and that Aldous Webb's testimony about the water rights filing would be needed before the end of the month. Cal had looked at her for a moment, then at Daniel, then back at her. "I'll bring him back," he said. "Or just his written statement," she said. "Notarized if he'll do it." "I'll try for both." He rode before the hands had finished breakfast. Nobody spoke about where he'd gone. Pete kept the work moving as if nothing had changed, because Pete understood instinctively that the best thing to do when something important and fragile was in motion was to make as little noise about it as possible. 3 days went by. They were not quiet days. On the second day, Eliza went to town for supplies. Daniel had offered to go, and she'd declined firmly because she understood that the right move was to be seen to be normal, to be Eliza Cole of the Cole Ranch, buying flour and coffee, and giving Clara Hutchins a brief smile in front of whoever was watching. Which someone always was when Victor Hale wanted someone watched. She was at the counter of Hutchins' store when she heard it. 2 men behind her, not bothering to lower their voices in the deliberate way of men who want to be overheard. "Heard the marshal from Laramie's coming through next week." "That right?" "Yep, something about a complaint filed. Land matter, I think. Or maybe a warrant. Hard to say." Eliza counted out her coins onto the counter without a single change in her expression. Clara Hutchins looked at her with steady eyes and said nothing. Eliza picked up her parcel, said, "Thank you, Clara," and walked out. She did not hurry. She did not look at the 2 men. She got back on the wagon, drove 3 blocks down Main Street at a normal pace, turned north onto the road home, and then, when the town was out of sight, pushed the horse to a full run. "A week," she said when she got back to the ranch. "We have a week, maybe less." Daniel was at the barn. He straightened when he saw the way she came in. "Marshal." "From Laramie. Victor filed something, I don't know what yet, whether it's the warrant from Denver or a land complaint or both. But it's coming, and it's coming before Cal can possibly get back from Meridian." Daniel was quiet for a moment. She could see him running the numbers the same way she had. Cal had been gone 2 days. Meridian was 3 days' ride. Webb might need persuading. The trip back was another 3 days. At minimum, 10 days total. The marshal would be here in 7. "Then we need something else," he said. "I know." "What?" She had been thinking about it for the entire ride back. Thinking about everything she knew, everything she'd heard, every piece of information she'd collected and stored in 3 years of being too afraid to use it. Because using it had always meant exposing herself, making herself visible, giving Richard and Victor a target they could see clearly instead of a shadow they were still chasing. She had spent 3 years choosing survival over confrontation. She was done with that arithmetic. "There's a lawyer in Granger," she said. "I saw his office on the stage route coming in. Emmett Branch, his name was on the sign. I know Emmett. He's solid. If we get him everything, we have the water rights documentation, the testimony about what I overheard in Denver, the fence damage records you've been keeping, and he files a preemptive action against Victor for property harassment and interference. Then Victor's complaint to the marshal lands on top of an existing legal dispute, which makes it more complicated for everyone involved to simply rule in Victor's favor." Daniel looked at her. "You want to go on a fence," he said. "I want to stop being the thing they're hunting and start being the thing they have to answer to," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his face, not just agreement, but something closer to recognition. The expression of a man who has been doing the sensible, careful, quiet thing for 2 years and is finally ready to be done with it. "I'll ride to Granger tomorrow," he said. "We'll ride," she said. He didn't argue. Emmett Branch was a short, compact man of 60, with ink-stained fingers, and the specific, unhurried intelligence of someone who had spent decades reading documents that other people assumed nobody would read carefully. He listened to everything. He didn't interrupt. He read every paper Daniel laid on his desk, asked 3 precise questions, and then leaned back in his chair and looked at them both over the rims of his spectacles. "Mr. Cole," he said, "I'm going to be direct with you. The case you're building here is real. The water rights challenge Victor Hale is preparing is documented in the county land office. I've seen the preliminary filings, and I will tell you plainly that someone with knowledge of how to locate obscure procedural vulnerabilities prepared them. That is not Victor Hale's legal mind. Victor's lawyer is a man named Thorpe, and Thorpe doesn't have the subtlety for this." He paused. "Someone from outside the county helped prepare this." "Richard Vance," Eliza said. Emmett turned his spectacles on her. "That is a serious accusation. I have serious evidence." She slid the folded paper across his desk, the one she'd been carrying since Denver, the one she'd written the night she left, because she'd understood even then that a woman leaving under a theft accusation needed to document everything she knew while she still could. Names, dates, specific words from the conversation she'd overheard. The name Caldwell mentioned 3 months before she'd ever heard of this town. "I don't know if it's enough for a court, but it's enough to force questions that Victor and Richard would prefer not to be asked." Emmett read the page, read it again. "Where did you get this?" he said. "I wrote it," she said. "The night I left Denver. I've been carrying it for 8 months." He looked at her over the spectacles again, with an expression she hadn't expected, not skepticism, not calculation, but something close to sadness. "Young woman," he said quietly, "you've been carrying a loaded weapon in your pocket this entire time and running from the men who were afraid of it." She had not thought of it in exactly those terms before. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I have." He set the page down. "I'll file today. The preemptive harassment action will be on record before the marshal arrives, which changes the legal landscape considerably." He paused. "I won't pretend this resolves everything, but it changes the terms of the fight." He looked at Daniel. "Your water rights documentation is solid. Webb's original filing is clean. If we can get Webb's testimony even written, this becomes significantly harder for Victor to press." "Cal's in Meridian," Daniel said. "Then pray he's persuasive." Emmett began gathering papers. "Go back to the ranch. Keep records of everything. Do not engage Victor directly. And do not," he said, looking at Eliza with particular emphasis, "let him get you alone in a conversation you haven't prepared for." "Understood," she said. They rode back in the long afternoon light, and for a while neither of them spoke. The road was empty, and the wind had quieted, and the world had the particular held-breath quality of the hour before something breaks. "That paper you've been carrying," Daniel said eventually. "You wrote it the night you left Denver." "Yes." "What made you think to do that?" She considered the question honestly. "Because I knew that if I didn't write it down immediately, I would talk myself out of knowing what I knew. Fear does that. It makes the facts seem less certain than they are." She kept her eyes on the road. "My father used to say that the most dangerous moment is not when someone is threatening you. It's the moment after, when you start negotiating with yourself about whether what you saw was really what you saw." Daniel was quiet. "He sounds like he was a thoughtful man," he said. He was. Another silence. Easier than the first ones had been. "He'd have liked this ranch," she said, surprising herself slightly by saying it. Daniel turned his head to look at her. She kept her eyes forward, but she felt it, the quality of his attention, the particular weight of being noticed by someone who noticed things slowly and carefully and didn't look away. "I think," he said, "that we should talk tonight about the arrangement." Something tightened in her chest. "What about it?" "About whether it needs to change," he said, "into something more formal." She turned then and looked at him. The last light was going amber, and the road stretched flat and long ahead, and his face was not quite unreadable anymore, she realized. She'd learned to read it. She wasn't sure when that had happened. "Daniel, the legal protection would be stronger," he said, "if there was an actual record." "Is that what you're saying that for?" she said carefully. "The legal protection." He held her gaze. No, he said. She turned back to the road. Her heart was doing something she didn't have a clean word for. Let's get through the next week, she said quietly. Then we'll talk. He nodded. But the thing that had been building between them slowly, steadily, with the same kind of patient accumulation as everything else about this man, did not go back to where it had been. Some doors, once opened a crack, do not close again. The marshal arrived on Thursday. His name was Cutter. He was lean, efficient, and had the air of a man who processed other people's disputes the way a mill processes grain, without particular feeling for the grain, interested primarily in the output. He came to the ranch in the early afternoon, with Victor Hale riding 2 lengths behind him, which told Eliza everything she needed to know about who had arranged this visit and how. She answered the door. Cutter looked at her. "Ma'am, I'm looking for Daniel Cole." "He's here," she said. "Come in." She did not look at Victor. Victor looked at her. She felt it the way you feel cold, not from one direction, but from all of them at once. They gathered in the main room. Daniel stood by the window. Eliza stood beside him, not beside, and Cutter spread 3 papers on the table and explained the nature of the complaint in the flat procedural tone of a man who had done this many times. A warrant from Denver, signed by a judge for the arrest and extradition of one Eliza Hart on charges of theft from the household of Richard Vance. A land use complaint filed by Victor Hale alleging improper water diversion on the Cole property. And a third document, which Cutter unfolded last, that Eliza had not expected. An affidavit, signed by Richard Vance, stating that he had reason to believe the woman currently residing at the Cole Ranch was indeed Eliza Hart, and that she had, while employed in his household, accessed confidential business documents without authorization. Not just stolen money. Confidential business documents. The room was very quiet. Eliza understood exactly what that meant. It meant Richard knew what she'd heard. It meant he knew about the page she'd been carrying. It meant Victor had told him, which meant Victor had already connected the dots between her presence on this ranch and what she might know that could destroy them both. They weren't trying to remove her from the county anymore. They were trying to silence her before she could speak. "Marshal," Daniel said, and his voice was so steady it almost frightened her. "Are you aware that before you arrived, we filed a preemptive harassment complaint against Mr. Hale with Emmett Branch in Granger, citing documented property interference on 3 separate occasions in the past 2 weeks?" Cutter blinked, just slightly. "I was not." "Then you'll want to see this." Daniel produced the papers Emmett had given them, the filed complaint, the time-stamped registry confirmation. Everything. He laid them on the table next to Victor's documents with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been preparing for this moment. Victor's jaw moved. "That doesn't answer the Denver warrant," he said. "No," Daniel agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at Cutter. "But it establishes that Mr. Hale has a documented history of harassment against this property and its residents, which a judge might find relevant when evaluating his credibility as a witness supporting that warrant." Cutter looked at the papers. He looked at Victor. He looked back at Daniel. "The warrant requires a response," he said. "I can give you until Monday, but I'll need the woman." He corrected himself. "Mrs. Cole to present herself at the county office in Caldwell on Monday morning with whatever documentation she has. If the warrant is contested, it goes before the circuit judge." "The circuit judge," Eliza said, "who arrives in 6 weeks," Victor said, and smiled, and the smile meant you don't have 6 weeks and we both know it. Cutter gathered his papers. "Monday," he said. After he left, Victor stood for a moment in the doorway. He looked at Eliza with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the calculating coldness of their previous encounters, but something raw. Something that looked almost like fury being held at the edges by the thinnest possible membrane of control. "I know what you have," he said quietly, "and I know you know that I know. So let me make this simple for you, Mrs. Cole. Walk away from this ranch, leave Caldwell, and the Denver warrant disappears. You have Richard's word on that." Richard's word, she said evenly, is not worth the air it takes to carry it. The membrane held, barely. Monday, he said, and walked out. Daniel closed the door. He turned to look at her, and she was already turning to look at him, and they stood in the quiet room with the weight of what had just happened settling down around them like snow. He knows about the page, she said. Yes. Which means Richard told him, which means they've been talking about me specifically about what I know, not just about the warrant. Yes. Daniel. She stopped, steadied herself. The affidavit about the documents. That changes what this is. This isn't Victor harassing a neighboring rancher anymore. This is two men coordinating across state lines to suppress a witness to land fraud. She met his eyes. If we can prove that, not just imply it, prove it, then the warrant becomes the least of their problems. We need Webb, he said. We need Webb, and we need... She stopped. Something had occurred to her. Something she'd been holding away from the edges of her mind because it was frightening in a different way than the legal trouble was frightening. Richard's wife, she said slowly. Daniel frowned. Margaret Vance. She knew. Eliza's voice had dropped to something nearly private. She knew what her husband was doing. She knew about me, what he accused me of, and she looked at me the morning I was dismissed, and she didn't say a word, but she looked at me the way a woman looks at another woman when she wants to say something and has decided she can't afford to. She looked at Daniel. I think Margaret Vance has been waiting for someone to give her a reason. You think she'd testify against her own husband? I think she's been sitting on something for a long time, Eliza said. And I think if someone came to her directly, not as a threat, not as a legal proceeding, but woman to woman honestly, she might be ready to let it go. We can't get to Denver and back before Monday. No, but we can get a letter there by telegraph if we word it carefully enough. She was already moving, already thinking through the language. And Clara Hutchins told me Margaret Vance has a sister in Granger. I don't know if she's in contact with her, but if she is, Clara would know how to reach the sister, Daniel said. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. And then he said something she hadn't expected. Eliza. Just her name. Nothing else. But the way he said it, with that particular quiet, with the weight of a man choosing to say something true rather than something useful, made her go very still. Whatever happens Monday, he said. However this lands, I want you to know that when I told Cord you were my wife, it wasn't only strategy. She looked at him. Daniel, I know the timing's wrong, he said. I know this isn't the moment, but I've been carrying it for 2 weeks, and I don't think it serves either of us for me to keep pretending I'm not. He held her gaze with the same steadiness he applied to everything, not performing it, just being it. You can ignore that entirely if you need to. I'll understand. She didn't ignore it. She also didn't move toward him, not yet, not with Monday bearing down on them, and Victor Hale somewhere in the dark, riding back to town with whatever he was planning next. But she didn't look away either. Ask me again, she said quietly. When this is over, ask me the same thing when we're not standing in the middle of a war, and there's nothing strategic riding on the answer. He nodded. Something settled in his face, not relief exactly, more like a man who has put something important down in a safe place and knows where it is. All right, he said. Outside, the Thursday evening was coming in hard from the west, bringing real weather, the kind that had been threatening all week, that moved like something with intention. I need to write to Clara tonight, Eliza said. And we need to draft something for Margaret Vance. I'll get the lamp, Daniel said. They sat at the kitchen table until past midnight, writing, revising Eliza, composing words she'd never thought she'd write to a woman she'd met only briefly, but never forgotten. Daniel reading them carefully, and saying almost nothing except once, near the end, when he read a particular line she'd written about truth being a kind of freedom, and said quietly, "That's exactly right. It's exactly." And outside the storm that had been gathering all week, finally broke wind and rain hard against the windows, the creek running high and fast along the east fence line. The sound of the ranch holding itself together, the way things hold together when they're built to last. She was still frightened. But for the first time in 3 years, she was frightened on solid ground. That was not nothing. That, in fact, was everything. The letter to Clara went out Friday morning with Pete, who rode into Caldwell with a supply list in one hand and Eliza's sealed note in the other, looking for all the world like a ranch hand running an ordinary errand. He was back before noon. Clara's reply came tucked under the supply receipt, 3 lines in a neat small hand that told Eliza everything she needed. Margaret Vance's sister was Ruth Galley, and Ruth lived on the east side of Granger, and Clara had known her for 4 years through the Methodist Women's Circle, and if Eliza wanted to speak with her, Clara could arrange it. Could she arrange it by Saturday? Clara wrote back within the hour Saturday noon. Her store. Come through the back. Daniel read the exchange over Eliza's shoulder and didn't say a word. He simply went to saddle 2 horses. Ruth Galley was a smaller, quieter version of what Eliza imagined Margaret Vance might be. Fine-boned, careful, with the specific kind of stillness that belongs to women who have spent years in proximity to powerful men and learned that stillness was the safest form of attention. She looked at Eliza for a long moment before she said anything. "You're the one from the ranch," she said. "Yes. Margaret wrote to me about you." Ruth's hands were folded on the table. "Not by name. She didn't know your name then. But she described a woman who worked in the house who Richard dismissed. She said," she paused, choosing words carefully. "She said she was ashamed of how it was handled." Eliza felt something move through her chest. Not vindication, it was too complicated for that. Something raw. "Is Margaret in contact with her?" Daniel asked. "We write," Ruth said. "Once a month, sometimes more. She's—" Another pause. "Margaret's situation is not a simple one. Richard is not a violent man, but he is a man who controls everything around him very deliberately, including his wife, and Margaret has known for years that certain things were wrong and has not had the means or the courage to address them." Ruth looked at Eliza steadily. "Until now, possibly." "What changed?" Eliza asked. "You changed it. Or rather, what Victor Hale told Richard changed it." Margaret overheard a conversation last week. Richard told Victor that the woman from the ranch had a document-written testimony, and that they needed to move fast to discredit her before it could be presented anywhere formal. Ruth's voice stayed even. Margaret had not known until that conversation the full scope of what Richard and Victor had planned regarding the Caldwell water rights. She had understood pieces of it. Hearing it stated plainly, hearing that a woman's life was being destroyed as a mechanism of a land fraud scheme that was different. The room was very quiet. "She has something," Eliza said. It wasn't a question. Ruth reached into her coat and produced an envelope. It was thick, sealed with plain wax. "She sent this 3 days ago," Ruth said, "before she knew you'd contact me. She wrote it on her own and sent it to me for safekeeping because she didn't trust what Richard might do if he found it in the house." She slid it across the table. She said, "If anyone ever comes asking about the woman from Denver, give them this." Eliza looked at the envelope. She looked at Daniel. He gave her the smallest nod. She broke the seal. Margaret Vance's handwriting was precise and unhurried, the penmanship of a woman who had been educated carefully and who chose every word with the same care. The letter ran 4 pages. Eliza read it without speaking. Daniel read it over her shoulder, and she heard the precise moment he understood what he was reading. A slight change in his breathing, nothing more. Margaret had written down everything. Not as a legal document, she wasn't a lawyer and didn't pretend to be, but as a personal account specific and dated of every conversation she had witnessed or overheard between Richard Vance and Victor Hale over the past 3 years. The first mention of the Caldwell water corridor. The discussion of how to acquire the rights without open confrontation. The decision to use legal manipulation rather than direct purchase, because direct purchase would have required Daniel Cole's cooperation, which Victor had already determined he would never get. And then, near the end of the third page, a paragraph that made Eliza's hands go very still on the paper. Margaret had witnessed Richard instruct a man, not his lawyer, not a business associate, a man whose name she didn't know, to place a specific amount of money into the household account records and alter the documentation to show it had been withdrawn by a household employee. She had not understood what it was for at the time. She understood it now. It was the theft. Richard hadn't accused Eliza of stealing money that was missing. He had manufactured the evidence of a theft that had never occurred. Eliza set the pages down on the table. She had known this. She had known it the way you know something when you were there and watched it happen, and then spent 3 years being told by a legal system and a city full of his connections that what you knew wasn't what you knew. But knowing and having it written, dated, signed by a witness who had no reason to lie and every reason to stay silent, that was different. Her eyes were dry. She noticed that. No tears, not from relief, not from the long-delayed vindication of it. Just a very deep, very still silence in the center of her chest where the fear had lived for 3 years. "Eliza," Daniel said quietly. "I'm fine," she said. And then more honestly, "I'm more than fine." She looked at Ruth. "Will Margaret sign an affidavit formally, in front of a notary?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "She wants to. She asked me to ask you, is there a way to do it without Richard knowing before it's presented? Because if he knows, he'll—" "Emmett Branch in Granger," Daniel said. "He can travel to Denver if needed, or arrange for a notary there who isn't connected to Vance's network." Ruth nodded slowly. "Then yes, I believe she will." Eliza folded the letter back into the envelope with the careful precision of someone handling something irreplaceable. "Tell her thank you," she said. "Tell her what she's done is an act of real courage." Ruth almost smiled. "I'll tell her. She'll say it wasn't courage. She'll say she just got tired of the weight of it." "That's what courage usually is," Eliza said. They rode back to the ranch with the envelope inside Eliza's coat pressed flat against her side. The ride was different from any of the previous rides. Not heavy with strategy, not weighted with worry. Something had opened just slightly, just enough to let something else in. Daniel rode close beside her, and she was aware of every degree of that proximity in a way she hadn't let herself be before, because before there had always been the next problem pressing too hard against the present moment. "Monday is still the problem," Daniel said. "Monday is manageable now," she said. "Emmett files Margaret's letter as a supporting document to our preemptive complaint. It doesn't dismiss the warrant that requires a judge, but it establishes that the warrant's foundation is fraudulent and that there is a witness willing to swear to it." She paused. "The marshal has to take that seriously. He's not a corrupt man. I watched his face when you showed him our filing. He's a procedural man. Give him correct procedure and he'll follow it. And Victor." Victor's position just became significantly more complicated. She said it quietly, but something in her voice carried the particular satisfaction of a person who has been patient for a very long time and is finally watching patience pay out. "He built this on Richard's word. Richard's word now has Margaret's word against it. And Margaret was there." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You thought of her," he said. "Margaret, days ago when we were still figuring out how to get to Monday." "She was always the piece," Eliza said. "She was always the person with the most to lose and the most to give. I just didn't know if she'd gotten tired enough." She glanced at him. "People only move when they're ready. You can't rush that." He looked at her with that expression she had learned to read, the one that was not quite a smile, but carried everything a smile would have carried. "You know a great deal about people," he said. "I've needed to," she said simply. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and the afternoon was mild, and the road was dry, and everything about the moment was ordinary and specific in the way that moments become when you're suddenly aware of being in them. "I have something to ask you," Daniel said. "Before Monday, before all of it." She waited. "I want to file the marriage properly," he said, "with Emmett before Monday morning. Not for the legal protection, or not only for that." He kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was the most unguarded she'd ever heard it. "I want it to be real, because I want it to be real. Not because of Victor or the warrant or the water rights." He paused. "You told me to ask you again when there was nothing strategic riding on the answer. I'm asking." The road stretched ahead of them, long and flat, the ranch visible now in the middle distance. She thought about the first moment she'd seen him standing at the edge of a boardwalk, in a town that didn't know her, picking up a bag that wasn't his responsibility. She thought about the kitchen that had become a place she recognized. She thought about midnight at the table and coffee, and the sound of rain against the window, and the particular quality of a silence shared with someone who didn't need to fill it. She thought about being tired of running, about being ready to stop. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. "Yes," he said. "You asked," she said. "That's my answer." Something moved through his face that she had not seen before, unguarded and clean and entirely real, the expression of a man who had prepared himself for the possibility of no and did not quite know what to do with yes. "All right," he said. His voice had gone slightly rougher. "All right," she agreed. They kept riding. But something had settled between them, permanent and quiet, like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples already spreading outward in all directions. Sunday came in fast and cold. Cal rode in at sundown, which was a day earlier than expected. He had Aldous Webb with him. Not just a letter, the man himself, 70 years old, sharp-eyed, and deeply annoyed about having been pulled from his work with the railroad survey team in Meridian on 3 days' notice. But he was there. Daniel came out to meet them, and Eliza came behind him, and Cal looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had ridden hard, and was proud of it, and was trying not to show it too openly. "He came," Cal said unnecessarily. "I can see that," Daniel said. "Thank you." Aldous Webb climbed down from his horse with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees had opinions, looked around the property and said, "You're the Cole Ranch." "I am," Daniel said. "I filed your water rights in '71. Webb squinted at him. "You look younger than I expected." "My father's rights originally. I inherited." Webb grunted. "Your father was a straight man. Filed everything correctly. I remember because half the filings that year were a mess, and his wasn't." He looked at Daniel directly. "Someone's contesting them. Victor Hale." Webb's expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the specific way of someone whose opinion of a situation just hardened into something definitive. "I know Hale. Tried to get me to misfile a survey boundary in '74 for a man he was doing business with. I told him where he could put that idea." He looked at Eliza. "Who are you?" "Eliza Cole," she said. "Daniel's wife." Webb looked at her, looked at Daniel, looked back at her. Something in his expression said he had been around long enough to recognize a true thing when he saw one. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Emmett Branch rode out from Granger that evening. Daniel had sent Bo with a message the moment Cal appeared on the road, and by 9 o'clock on Sunday night, the kitchen table held more legal documents than it had held food in the past 2 weeks. Emmett organized them with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that thoroughness now saved catastrophe later. Webb dictated an affidavit confirming the original filing and its validity, and stating clearly that no procedural error existed that could support a challenge. Emmett wrote it out in full, had Webb sign it, and added his own witness signature. Then Emmett read Margaret Vance's letter. He read it twice. Then he looked at Eliza over his spectacles and said, "This woman is either very brave or has decided she has nothing left to lose." "Both, I think," Eliza said. "It's hearsay without a formal affidavit." "She'll sign one," Eliza said. Ruth Galley confirmed it. "Can you arrange it?" "I have a colleague in Denver who operates entirely outside Vance's network. I can telegraph him tonight and have him at Margaret's door by Tuesday if she's willing to receive him." He paused. "It won't be ready for Monday morning." It doesn't have to be ready for Monday, Daniel said. It has to be ready for the circuit judge. Monday, we just need to keep the ground. Emmett nodded slowly. Monday, you present the Webb affidavit, the harassment filing, and a sworn statement from Mrs. Cole regarding the full circumstances of the Denver accusation. He looked at her. You'll need to tell it plainly. In front of the marshal and Victor Hale will almost certainly be there. I know. He'll try to destabilize you. He'll bring things up that are uncomfortable. He can bring whatever he likes, she said. I've been carrying the truth for 8 months. It's not heavy anymore. Emmett studied her. No, he said after a moment. I don't expect it is. He left close to midnight, taking the Webb affidavit with him and promising to have the Denver Telegraph sent before morning. Webb slept in the spare room he was. It turned out the kind of man who adapted to situations without complaint, which Eliza suspected came from 40 years of surveying ground that had no interest in being convenient. The house went quiet. Pete and Bo and Asa had all made excuses to stay working late, which Eliza understood meant they were keeping watch without anyone having to say the word watch. She was grateful for that, for the particular loyalty of men who gave it without requiring acknowledgement. She was washing the last of the cups when Daniel came to stand in the kitchen doorway. "How are you?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, the way he'd asked it not as courtesy, but as actual inquiry. "Steadier than I've been in 3 years," she said. He nodded. "Come and sit," he said. "You've been on your feet all day." "So have you." "I'm not asking me," he said. "I'm asking you." She dried her hands and sat at the table, and he sat across from her, and they were quiet for a moment in the way that had become, without her quite deciding it should, one of the things she valued most about this house. The quality of the quiet. The fact that it didn't require filling. "I keep thinking about Margaret," she said, sitting with that letter for 3 days before she sent it to Ruth, not knowing if anyone would ever come for it. She knew someone would, Daniel said. She wouldn't have written it otherwise. That's a considerable amount of faith to extend toward a stranger. Or toward the truth, he said. Some people believe that the truth eventually finds its way to someone who can use it, even if it takes a while. She looked at him. "Do you believe that—" He thought about it honestly, which was one of the things she had come to rely on, the fact that he thought before he spoke and meant what he said when he got there. "I do now," he said. She wasn't entirely sure whether he was talking about truth in general or something more specific, and she decided she didn't need to ask. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he agreed. "Whatever happens in that room, whatever Victor says or brings or tries to use against me, I need you to let me answer it myself." She held his eyes. "I don't need protecting from my own history. I've been protecting it myself for a long time, and I've gotten good at it." "I know," he said. "But—" She stopped. Started again. "If it gets to a point where I need someone standing beside me rather than in front of me, I'd like to know you're there." Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, everything about this man was quiet, but it was there. "I'll be right beside you," he said. "The whole way through." She nodded once. Outside, the night was sharp and clear. The stars hard and brilliant, the way they get in October when the air has lost all its moisture and the sky has nothing left to hide behind. The creek ran along the east fence steady and cold, and the sound of it came through the walls the way it always did, a constant underneath everything else, the sound of the thing worth fighting for, moving along its ordinary course, indifferent to the people who understood its value. She thought tomorrow everything either holds or it doesn't. And then she thought, but either way, I know what happened. Margaret knows what happened. Daniel knows. And 3 years of being told by powerful men that what I knew wasn't real ends tomorrow in a room in Caldwell, in front of a procedural marshal who believes in correct process. She was not afraid. She was tired. Genuinely deeply tired, the way a person gets when they've been carrying something for too long and can finally see the place where they'll be able to set it down. But she was not afraid. Not anymore. Monday morning came in clear. Eliza dressed carefully, not to impress, not to perform respectability, but because she understood that presentation was a form of argument, and she intended to make every argument available to her. She wore her best dress, the one she'd kept pressed in the bottom of the carpet bag, through every town and every coach and every departure at odd hours. She put her hair up neatly and stood in front of the small mirror and looked at herself. The woman looking back was not the woman who had stepped off a stage in Caldwell with 37 cents and a torn sleeve. She was someone who had built something in 3 weeks on difficult ground. Someone with a name that was real now in the way that mattered. Someone who was about to walk into a room where a man was going to try to take apart her life in front of witnesses and who was going to stand there and let him try. She picked up the web affidavit, Margaret Vance's letter, and the harassment filing. Daniel was waiting in the hall. He looked at her and said nothing for a moment. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. They walked out together into the clear October morning, and Pete held the wagon and Asa and Bo stood by the barn, with expressions that were working hard at being neutral and failing in the best possible way. And she thought, this is what it looks like when people decide to be on your side. She climbed up onto the wagon. Daniel climbed up beside her. They drove toward Caldwell, and the road was straight and dry, and the sun was coming up hard in the east, and beside her, his shoulder just barely touching hers. Daniel Cole kept the horse steady and said nothing, and that was exactly right. She was not going in to survive this. She was going in to end it. The marshal's office in Caldwell was a single room with a plank floor and 2 windows that let in more cold than light. By the time Daniel and Eliza arrived, Victor Hale was already there, which she had expected, and he had not come alone. She saw the second man the moment she stepped through the door, and for 1 full second, the room tilted. Richard Vance. Not a letter, not an affidavit, not a name on a document. The man himself standing in the corner of the marshal's office in a good coat and polished boots, holding his hat in both hands, watching her come through the door with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not cruelty, not triumph. Nervousness. That told her more than anything else he could have said. Marshal Cutter stood at his desk. Emmett Branch was already seated to one side, and the presence of Eliza's own lawyer in the room before the proceedings began was a small but significant message, a statement of preparation that Cutter would understand immediately. Victor registered Emmett. His expression shifted. Richard registered Emmett, and then he looked back at Eliza, and something moved through his face that she read precisely. He had not expected her to come in prepared. He had expected her to come in frightened. She pulled out a chair, sat down, folded her hands on the table, and looked at Marshal Cutter. "We're ready when you are," she said. Gag. Cutter was methodical. He laid out the situation in the flat procedural language he used for everything. The Denver warrant, its basis, the complaint from Victor Hale regarding water rights and land use, and the preemptive harassment filing from Daniel Cole. He made no editorial comment. He simply arranged the pieces on the table the way a man arranges tools before a job. Then he said, "Mr. Vance, you've traveled from Denver to speak to the warrant in person." "I have," Richard said. He had a cultivated voice, smooth measured, the kind of voice that came from years of using it in rooms where impression mattered more than truth. "The woman currently claiming to be Mrs. Cole is a former employee of mine who left my service under suspicion of theft. I have the documentation with me." He produced a folder. Cutter took it, looked through it. "Mrs. Cole," Cutter said. "Do you wish to respond?" "I do," Eliza said. She opened her own folder. "This is an affidavit from Aldous Webb, the original surveyor who filed the Cole water rights in 1871, confirming their validity and the absence of any procedural basis for Mr. Hale's challenge." She slid it across. "This is a documented record of 3 separate incidents of deliberate property interference on the Cole Ranch, dated and witnessed, forming the basis of our harassment complaint." She slid that across. "And this," she said, producing the last document, "is a personal letter from Margaret Vance, Richard Vance's wife, detailing with specific dates and direct quotation conversations she witnessed between her husband and Victor Hale regarding the coordinated scheme to acquire the coal water rights through legal manipulation and the deliberate falsification of household financial records used to construct the theft accusation against me. The room went absolutely still. Richard Vance's face did something complicated and uncontrolled, the expression of a man who has just watched the floor drop out from a situation he believed he had sealed shut. Victor moved, just slightly, just enough. Cutter looked at the letter. He read it slowly. "This is your wife's hand," he said to Richard. Richard said nothing. "Mr. Vance," Cutter said, "I asked you a question. That letter," Richard said, and his voice had lost its calibration, "was obtained without—" "Your wife sent it voluntarily to her sister in Granger 3 days ago," Eliza said. "Her sister gave it to me. No court order, no coercion, no theft." She looked at Richard directly for the first time since walking in, and she held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who no longer had anything to protect from him. Margaret wrote it freely, because she was tired. The silence held for another second. Then Victor Hale said, "This is manufactured, Mr. Hale." Emmett Branch's voice was quiet, but it cut the room cleanly. "I would encourage you to think very carefully about what words you choose in front of a federal marshal regarding a document from a named witness." He paused. "Carefully." Victor closed his mouth. Cutter set the letter down. He looked at Richard Vance. He looked at Victor Hale. He looked at Eliza. "The warrant from Denver," he said. "Based on your wife's account, the financial records supporting the theft accusation were deliberately falsified." "I will be making a formal statement to that effect," Eliza said. "And Mrs. Vance will be providing a notarized affidavit within the week through Emmett Branch's colleague in Denver." Cutter leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to hold the warrant pending review of that affidavit," he said. "I am not going to enforce an arrest order from a jurisdiction where the basis of that order is now in direct dispute from a witness with first-hand knowledge." He looked at Richard. "Mr. Vance, I would strongly suggest you consult a lawyer before this week is out." Richard's jaw was tight. "That'll do," Cutter said. "Mr. Hale, the water rights challenge will be returned to the land office for full review in light of Mr. Webb's affidavit. Until that review is complete, no action can be taken against the coal property." He gathered the papers with the orderly precision of a man closing a chapter. "We're done here for today." Victor stood up. He looked at Eliza. It was not the look of a man who had accepted defeat. It was the look of a man who was recalculating. And that distinction mattered because a man who recalculates is not a man who has stopped. "This isn't finished," he said. He said it to her specifically, not to Daniel, not to Emmett, to her. She met his eyes. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But the part where you got to run it in the dark is." Outside, the morning had gone bright. Daniel came to stand beside her on the boardwalk, and she was aware of the particular quality of his nearness, the way a person becomes aware of warmth after a long, cold stretch. "That was—" he started. "Don't say remarkable," she said. "I was going to say earned," he said. She looked at him. The tight thing in her chest that had lived there for 3 years, not entirely gone, not yet, because Victor's last look was real, and Richard still had a lawyer, and the affidavit was still a week away, but loosened. Fundamentally, irreversibly loosened. "The affidavit has to hold," she said. "It will." He was watching her face. "Eliza." I know we're not done." She exhaled. "I just need 1 minute where I let it be enough that today held." "Take the minute," he said. "You've earned that too." She let herself have it. 1 full minute in the October light, with the weight she'd been carrying, doing something it hadn't done in a very long time, something close to lifting. Then Emmett appeared behind them and said, "Victor's going to contest the water rights review." And the minute was over, and the work resumed the way work always resumes, because that's what work does. The week that followed was the kind of week that a person looks back on later and can't fully account for, not because nothing happened, but because so many things happened simultaneously that the chronology blurs into a texture of motion and decision and consequence. Emmett's colleague in Denver found Margaret Vance at home and willing. She signed the affidavit on Wednesday, without hesitation, according to the telegraph message that arrived Thursday afternoon, and she asked the notary to please ensure that the document reached the appropriate parties without delay, which it did by Friday, in Emmett's hands, which had never in his professional life held anything he was quite as satisfied to be holding. Cal, who had ridden to Meridian and back, and then spent the rest of the week quietly keeping watch on the road south without being asked to, told Pete on Thursday evening that he'd seen two men leave Hale's property with saddled horses and luggage that suggested they were not coming back anytime soon. Pete told Daniel. Daniel told Eliza. She was in the kitchen when he came in with that information, and she set down the spoon she was holding and turned and looked at him and said, "Which two men?" "Cord," Daniel said. "And the young one who was with him that first day." She thought about that. "Victor's cutting weight." "That's what I think too. He's preparing to contest the review through legal channels only. He's pulling back anyone who could be connected to the property harassment directly." She leaned against the counter. "That means he's still in this, but he's changed his approach. He's going to try to outlast us legally. Longer review, more filings appeals." "Which costs money," she said. "Which he has." "More than us," Daniel said. "Yes." They looked at each other across the kitchen, and the reality of that sat between them, not catastrophically, not with the cold terror of the early days, but with the sober weight of a long fight that was going to require stamina and resources and patience over months rather than weeks. "Emmett says there's a provision," Eliza said, "in county land law. If a challenge to water rights can be demonstrated to have been filed in bad faith, which Margaret's affidavit directly establishes, then the challenger bears the full cost of the review proceeding. Victor would be paying for his own defeat." Daniel stared at her. "Emmett told you this today?" "Emmett told me this morning while you were out with Pete. I asked him specifically what provisions existed to prevent wealthy men from using legal process as a weapon of attrition against people with less money." She met his eyes. He seemed pleased by the question. Something broke open in Daniel's expression, not his composure, which was unshakable, but something underneath it. Something that had been held carefully in check for weeks and was now very quietly letting go. "You have been 3 steps ahead of every piece of this," he said. "I've had more practice being targeted than you have," she said simply. "That's not what I mean." He moved into the kitchen closer in the deliberate way of a man who has decided to move toward something rather than be cautious about it. "I mean that you came here with 37 cents and a torn sleeve, and in 3 weeks you have dismantled a conspiracy that 2 powerful men built over 3 years. His voice was even, but his eyes were not. "That is not practice. That is you." She looked up at him. He was close. The kitchen was quiet. "Daniel, I know. I said I'd wait until it was over." "It's not entirely over." "No," he said. "But the part where you might have to leave is." She held his gaze. And then he did something she hadn't expected. Something entirely characteristic of him and entirely unexpected in the same moment. He lifted his hand slowly and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face. Just that. Just the simple, careful gesture of a man who has been wanting to do a precise thing for a long time and has finally allowed himself. Her breath went somewhere quiet. "I am not going to leave," she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. "I know that," he said. "Now." He leaned forward. She leaned toward him, the same degree, the same deliberate, unhurried motion, and he kissed her. Not the way people kiss in performances of feeling, not dramatically, not with announcement. The way 2 people kiss when they have been working alongside each other in difficult country and have arrived finally at the same piece of ground at the same moment and recognize it. When she stepped back, her hands had found the front of his coat without her noticing. "That wasn't part of the plan," she said. "No," he said, and he was almost smiling, which on his face was the equivalent of a full laugh from anyone else. "Neither is what it did," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She released his coat, stepped back, cleared her throat in the brisk, practical way she did when she was covering over something that had gotten through her defenses. "Supper's going to burn." "Probably," he said, not moving. She turned back to the stove, but she was smiling, and she didn't attempt to hide it, and when she glanced back, he was still standing in the same place with the expression of a man who has found something he had stopped believing he would find and doesn't quite know yet what to do with having it. "Go wash up," she said. 6 o'clock. He went. The circuit judge arrived in Caldwell 4 weeks later, and what had been building across those 4 weeks came to its resolution in a county courthouse that smelled of old wood and lamp oil, and the particular dry cold of a room that held a great deal of waiting. Emmett presented the case with the quiet, comprehensive thoroughness of a man who had spent 30 years ensuring that the right documents were in the right hands at exactly the right moment. Margaret Vance's affidavit, Webb's testimony, the harassment record, Eliza's written account of what she had heard in Richard Vance's study in Denver, corroborated by Margaret's independent account of the same events from a different angle in the same room. The bad faith provision Eliza had identified applied. The judge ruled the water rights challenge frivolous on its face and fraudulent in its construction. Victor Hale was ordered to bear the full cost of the review proceeding and issued a formal finding against him that would follow his name into every subsequent land filing in the county. The Denver warrant was formally dismissed, the record corrected, the name Eliza Hart cleared of a theft that had never occurred and a court now said had never occurred. Richard Vance did not appear in court. He had, it emerged, left Denver 2 weeks prior with his business interests in considerable disarray, and his name attached to a civil suit filed by 3 other former employees who had been watching Margaret's courage from a distance and decided that if she could do it, they could too. Victor Hale sat in the courtroom through the entire proceeding with his jaw set and his hands very still on the arms of his chair, and he did not look at Eliza once, which she understood to mean he could not afford to. She looked at him, steadily, without anger, without satisfaction, just acknowledgement. "You tried. It didn't work. Now we both know what you are." When the judge struck his gavel and the room exhaled, Daniel's hand found hers under the table. She held it. They drove home in the last of the afternoon, and the light was the particular amber of late November. Low warm, the kind that makes everything it touches look like something worth keeping. Pete had apparently known the outcome before they arrived, because there was a fire already built in the main room and coffee on, and Beau had found a reason to be within visible range of the front window when they pulled in. And when he saw their faces, his own face did the thing young faces do when something good has happened that they were silently invested in. "Well," Pete said from the doorway. "Done," Daniel said. Pete nodded, once went inside, and said something to Asa that Eliza didn't hear. Asa, who had not expressed overt emotion about anything in the entire time she'd been on this ranch, made a sound that she was fairly certain was relief. She stood in the yard for a moment after Daniel went in. She looked at the property, the fence lines, the barn, the north pasture going golden in the late light, the creek visible at the far edge of the east field, running steady and cold, the way it always ran. The thing Victor had wanted so much that he'd been willing to ruin 2 lives to get it. Just water, just land, just everything to the people who knew what they had. She thought about the morning she'd stepped off the stage in Caldwell with 37 cents and no plan further than the next 3 hours. She thought about the look on Victor Hale's face when she'd told him to bring more men, and how that moment, reckless and frightened, and entirely her own, had been the first time in 2 years she'd made a decision that wasn't purely about disappearing. She thought about a man picking up a bag that wasn't his responsibility, about kitchen tables and late nights and bread rising and letters written at midnight and the sound of a creek running along the east fence line like it had always been doing and would always do. About what it felt like to stop running. Not because the road ended, not because she was trapped, but because she had found ground worth standing on. Daniel appeared in the doorway behind her. "Come inside," he said. She turned. He was watching her with that expression, the one she knew now, the one she had learned, the one that was not a performance of anything, but simply the face of a man who saw her clearly and wasn't afraid of what he saw. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, formally, now that there's nothing strategic riding on the answer. She walked toward him. "You already asked me," she said. "On the road to Granger." "That was informal," he said. "I want to ask properly." She stopped in front of him, close. Close enough to see the particular quality of his steadiness, which was not the absence of feeling, but its opposite feeling so grounded it had nowhere to go but into the bones. "Eliza," he said, "will you stay? Not for the ranch, not for the legal protection, not because you have nowhere else to go, because you've made abundantly clear that you could manage anywhere." He held her gaze. "Stay because this is where you want to be, because I want you here, because whatever we built in the last 6 weeks, I don't want to live in the version of this house where we didn't build it." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had picked up her bag on a street in a town that didn't know her, who had offered her terms she could understand and kept every one of them, who had said, "I want it to be real because I want it to be real," and then waited patiently with all the steady patience that was his fundamental nature for her to catch up. She had been so many things in the past 3 years: frightened, furious, careful, exhausted, strategic, alone. She had not in all of that time allowed herself to be simply certain. She was certain now. "Yes," she said. "That's my answer. The same as before and for every reason you just said and a few you didn't." He reached out and took her hand the same way he had in the courtroom, with the same quiet deliberateness, as if holding her hand was a decision he was making fully rather than an impulse. And he drew her inside out of the cold, into the warm and lamplit house that was hers as much as his, now in every way that mattered, and some that were also now legal. The door closed behind them. Outside, the November evening came down fast and final, the stars arriving early the way they do in that season, hard and clear above the flat country. The creek ran on along the east fence line, indifferent and faithful, the sound of it the same as it had been on every evening before this one. But inside the Cole Ranch house, something had changed permanently and irrevocably. Two people who had arrived at each other through loss and necessity and danger had discovered in the doing of it that necessity and choice are not always opposites, that sometimes the path you take to survive is the same path that leads you, if you are fortunate and honest and brave enough to stay on it directly to the life you would have chosen if you'd had the courage to choose. Eliza Hart had come to Caldwell with 37 cents a worn carpet bag and a name that powerful men had done their best to destroy. She left the courthouse that afternoon as Eliza Cole, cleared and certain and standing on ground that belonged to her in every sense of the word. And the man beside her, steady, quiet, real, in the way that only a few people in a lifetime are truly real, had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. That was not an arrangement. That was not a strategy. That was not pretend. That was the truest thing either of them had ever built, and it was going to last. "You said Viet Lai Fan Hook Modo Ko Kik Ban Ne Cook Mine,"